this week's topic is the urinary system. We're on page 235 of the notes packet. That's the McGraw-Hill notes packet. And looking at the major organs of the urinary system, the primary organ is the kidney. So we have a pair of kidneys. The left kidney is a little higher up in the body than the right, and they're located underneath the diaphragm and against the back wall of the abdominal cavity. So the kidney's job, they're basically filtering the blood and making urine. So as blood enters in down the abdominal aorta into the renal artery and into the kidney, that blood is filtered by the kidney by tiny little microscopic structures called nephrons, which we're going to talk about. But basically they filter the blood. And then when that plasma, the liquid component of blood, is filtered, that cleaned blood then goes back via the renal vein and to the inferior vena cava and back to the heart. So dirty blood is coming in through the renal artery. It's filtered by the kidney. The urine that's produced is drained from the kidney via the ureter. So all the plasma that's drained and that remains in the kidney that doesn't go back out through the renal vein will be drained from the kidney via the ureter, where it's stored in the bladder until it's convenient to go to the bathroom. So it's important when you look at the urinary system to see how closely tied it is to the cardiovascular system and in keeping the blood maintained in terms of not letting waste build up and making sure that the volume of that blood is kept within good control, because if we have too much volume in our blood, that's going to lead to high blood pressure. So the kidneys really play a big role in maintaining blood pressure. So what enters the ureters then from each kidney is the filtered plasma, which is called urine, but that's only 1% of the total blood that enters into the kidney. So just a small percentage of it is actually turned into urine. The majority of it is filtered and returned back to the general blood supply through the renal vein. So there's a pair of glands on top of the kidneys that's not part of the urinary system. It's actually part of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system we'll be talking about a little later, and those are the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands have a number of different functions, a number of different hormones that they produce, and we'll save that for when we talk about the endocrine system. So the kidneys, the ureters, and the bladder, those are the major organs of the urinary system. And then the urethra is the small passageway leading from the bladder to the outside of the body, and that's when urine can leave the body and be expelled. So those are the major organs and their functions: the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So looking at just major functions of the urinary system, they carry out excretion of metabolic wastes. So when we eat protein, for example, a byproduct of protein metabolism in our digestive tract is urea. So urea and uric acid and creatinine and ammonium or ammonia are produced through protein metabolism. When we eat things like meat and cheese and eggs, things that contain protein, our body turns that into these compounds, and those are excreted by the urinary system. So very important that we don't let those build up in the blood, because that can cause death over time. So people that have failed kidneys need to go to dialysis, otherwise these waste products build up in the blood and the pH of the blood drops and eventually causes death. So our kidneys really play an important role for maintaining our blood health. So again, when we look at urea, it's a breakdown of amino acids from when we eat proteins, and it releases ammonia. The liver will take care of that ammonia and convert it to carbon dioxide and urea, and it combines with carbon dioxide, doesn't produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide we know is another metabolic waste from our cells when we break down glucose. But ammonia combines with carbon dioxide and forms urea. So when people have liver disease, that's another big issue, because they can't convert that ammonia into urea, and then those ammonia levels build up in the blood, and that causes a lot of problems with mental functioning and also can cause death. So the kidneys and the liver kind of work together to process those protein metabolites like urea. So when you get elevated levels of waste in the blood, for example, someone that does not get dialysis, whose kidneys are failed, it can cause, heart rhythm problems, vomiting, respiratory problems, and eventually death. So very, very important that our kidneys are functioning and clearing out that building up of urea. Creatinine is another product that is produced by our muscles. When we use energy in our muscles, there's a special product in muscle cells called creatine phosphate, and we use that to make ATP. So the waste product of that is creatinine, and that ends up in the blood, and again needs to be filtered out by the kidneys and enters the urine. Uric acid is when we are breaking down and metabolizing nucleotides, which are found in DNA and RNA. So when we eat, again, any animal product, any living, like seafood is a kind of a high risk for people to have too much uric acid. It can end up crystallizing in the blood, and then those crystals settle in the lowest part of the body due to gravity, and that's usually the joint of the big toe. So the large joint of the big toe is where these crystals can settle, and it causes a lot of pain and swelling and redness, and we call that gout. So people that have a tendency towards gout usually take a daily medicine to keep that uric acid from crystallizing in the blood. So when we look at the kidneys, then another major function is just maintaining that water-salt balance, because when we drink a lot of fluid, or we have a very salty lunch, like a McDonald's supersize meal with salty fries and a salty sandwich, the job of the kidneys is to make sure that that salt doesn't remain in the blood, because salt draws water into the blood vessels. So when we absorb that salt from the digestive tract into our blood, that's going to pull water from the tissues. And maybe you've noticed a dry mouth, a couple hours after eating a salty meal. That's because that salt in your blood has soaked up water from your tissues. And again, that's not good for blood pressure. If we have too much salt and water, too much volume in the blood, that's going to cause higher blood pressure. So the job of the kidneys is to really monitor salt and water levels and make sure that that excess volume in the blood is then filtered out and turned into urine to be excreted. So another ion that's important to be regulated in the blood is potassium. So potassium is another ion that the kidneys can regulate, and also bicarbonate ion and calcium ion. So all of these ions are essential for electrolyte balance in the blood. So we need potassium and sodium for generating impulses from muscle and nerves, so those are essential for impulses, as well as calcium also plays a role in that. And bicarbonate is really important for transporting carbon dioxide to be exhaled through the respiratory system, and it's also important for blood pH. So the kidneys are really important for electrolyte balance, which are these essential ions. It's either going to excrete them or hang on to them and put them back to the blood. So a normal blood pH is a little more than 7, a little higher than 7, so slightly basic, and it's about 7.4. But the range of blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. So the kidneys can really help maintain that pH by excreting excess hydrogen ion if the pH is too low, and reabsorbing bicarbonate ion. So we know that hydrogen ion is an indicator of acid, and bicarbonate ion is basic. So if we need to raise the pH, if the pH starts to fall too low, the kidneys will excrete excess hydrogen ion, and it will reabsorb bicarbonate ion from the blood to keep that pH up above 7.35. So urine can end up being very acidic. If a person is excreting hydrogen ion and reabsorbing bicarbonate ion, that's going to make the pH pretty low. And that's okay, because the urine that's in the bladder is not part of the circulatory system. That's meant to be excreted. So we're not too concerned about the pH of the urine. It usually tells us what's going on with the kidneys when we look at the pH of the urine. Or it just might be that someone's been eating a lot of acidic foods, such as tomatoes or lemons. So some important hormones that are secreted by the kidney is renin. Renin is an important enzyme for controlling blood pressure. It plays a role in leading to the production of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex is important for reabsorbing sodium from the blood and putting it back into, reabsorbing sodium from the kidneys, and putting it back into the blood. So renin and aldosterone are important for raising a low blood pressure. So the kidneys will release renin, which causes production of aldosterone in the adrenal cortex. That's the outside of the adrenal gland. And those are all going to help reabsorb sodium and pull water into the blood to correct a falling blood pressure. Because a really low blood pressure is very dangerous for our organs. It's not going to get the oxygen those cells need, and the body can die very quickly. So having these hormones ready to go when blood pressure falls is an important way to maintain homeostasis. So the kidneys, again, are really vital for maintaining that blood pressure. So the kidneys also secrete another hormone called EPO. It's not related to blood pressure, but it's related to preventing anemia. So when a person has low oxygen levels, that's going to stimulate the kidneys to secrete EPO, which increases red blood cell production in the bone marrow of our bones. So it's important that we get good oxygen. So people that have lung disease and aren't getting enough oxygen are going to have overproduction of EPO, which means they're going to have a lot more red blood cells in their blood, and their blood's going to be a little thicker because of that, because the kidneys are trying to fix that low oxygen. But if it's bad lungs due to a lifetime of smoking, that can't really be corrected. So these people are just going to have chronically high EPO or hematocrit levels because of more red blood cell production due to that low oxygen in the blood, and the kidneys are trying to respond to that. And maybe you've heard of blood doping that athletes use. Some Olympic athletes have been caught, like Lance Armstrong, the famous cyclist. He was caught using blood doping, or where they remove a volume of blood and then by a doctor, and then the body responds to the low red blood cell count and low oxygen levels by secreting EPO to stimulate more red blood cell production in the bone marrow. And then the doctor, right before the event, will give them the blood that was taken out back, so that athlete has more than the average number of red blood cells than another athlete might have, and that gives them more power to perform in that athletic event, because there's more red blood cells, more oxygen carrying ability, and that person can go the extra distance. So now they carefully check hematocrit levels for athletes in the Olympics to prevent cheating with the use of that EPO and blood doping. Other functions of the kidneys, they also help make vitamin D. So when we expose the skin to the sun, we get the starting molecules of vitamin D, and then that vitamin D passes through the liver and is modified, and then the kidneys modify it one final time and make it into the useful form of vitamin D, which helps us absorb calcium from the digestive tract. And vitamin D has other roles in the body. It's been linked to depression. People with low vitamin D levels have shown symptoms of depression, so they always recommend vitamin D supplementation for anybody that suffers from depression. And we know that depression increases in the winter months when people aren't getting enough sunlight, so that makes sense if the starting molecules of vitamin D are formed in the skin when exposed to sun. If we're not exposed to sun, we're not getting enough vitamin D. We also have vitamin D in our milk. We've decided to fortify milk with vitamin D to make sure that our communities and country residents get enough vitamin D. So very important. So if you or someone you know struggles with depression or anxiety, it might not be a bad idea to supplement with some vitamin D. And you can talk to your doctor about a good dosage of that because we've been learning that a lot of us are not getting enough vitamin D in our diet, and it's hard to measure vitamin D levels accurately, but we've really increased the dosage now of what we think is a good daily requirement of vitamin D. So again, it might be a good idea to talk to your doctor about vitamin D levels and find out what would be a good dosage to supplement with. So when you look at the urinary system, then I said the major organs were the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So the kidneys, like we said, are on either side of the spine. They're on the back. They're partially protected by the rib cage, but they're pretty much just, on the back wall of the abdominal cavity, a little lower. They're darkish, reddish to brown in color. They're bean-shaped. You know what a kidney bean looks like. That's what they look like, but much larger. And they're covered by an outer covering called the renal capsule, just for protection. So we know that we have a renal artery bringing fresh oxygenated blood that needs to be filtered, and then the renal vein is deoxygenated blood leaving the kidney that has filtered clean blood. And then the ureters exit the kidney in the same place as the renal artery and renal vein, but they lead to the bladder. So the ureters are going to take that urine from the kidneys to the bladder. It has a smooth muscle layer, so it has contractions, just like we saw in the digestive tract of that smooth muscle, that are pushing urine into the bladder. So if you're upside down or laying flat, that movement of urine from the kidneys to the bladder continuously occurs because those wave-like contractions in the ureter are pushing that down into the bladder. So once it reaches the bladder, it's stored there until it's convenient for us to void is the term we call. To urinate means to void. So there's a couple of different openings. There's an internal urethra and an external urethra at the end of the bladder that allows the urine to come out voluntarily. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's the wrinkles. Just like we saw in the stomach, the wrinkles in the stomach allow it to stretch. Those wrinkles are called rugae. The same thing occurs in the bladder. When the bladder is not full of urine, it's very wrinkled, and we can see those visible rugae. But as the bladder fills with urine, it stretches out and the rugae disappear. So those wrinkles are gone just because the bladder is stretched. And the layer of cells that lines the bladder is called transitional epithelium, because when the bladder is empty, the cells look cuboidal. But when the bladder is full and stretched and the rugae have disappeared, then those cells look squamous. So it's not really one type of cell. It depends if the bladder is full or empty. So it transitions, that's why it's called transitional epithelium. It transitions from being cuboidal to squamous. So then we have folds in the mucosa at the top where the ureters enter, and that prevents backflow of urine into the ureter. So at the end of the bladder, the internal sphincter is composed of smooth muscle, and that relaxes when it's time to empty the bladder. But the external, and that's beyond, and that we cannot control because it's made of smooth muscle. But the external sphincter we can control and hold that urine back until it's convenient to relax and use the restroom or void. So the external sphincter is composed of skeletal muscle and it's under voluntary control, and the internal sphincter is composed of smooth muscle and is not under voluntary control. So this one will relax and allow urine to flow to that external opening of the urethra until we open that final opening, which is that external sphincter. We'll stop here and pick up in part 2 with the process of urination.